Hello, welcome to 8.9 News. I'm Finlo Costain. Today's headlines: world's first science-based targets will allow businesses to assess their impact on nature. Pasture-finished bison have higher metabolic health and are better for human health. And GSC Grays asks, could farmland be worth more for ecosystem services than food production? Natural England has sold the first credits to allow house builders to offset the impact of nitrates generated by development within the River Tees catchment. I spoke to Calum Gillhespy, Head of Planning and Development at Land and Estate Agents GSC Grays, and I asked him why he thinks that farmland could now be worth more for ecosystem services than for food production.
It's basically the commercial pressure to realise greater value from a use which is contingent on some form of ecosystem service. Now, that might be a need for biodiversity off gain from a development, or a company pursuing an environmental and social governance objective to make their business more sustainable, for instance. This provides competition to the agricultural use. In some instances, the new use might be paying more than farming can.
Do you have a sense of the proportion to which it's paying more, the proportion of additional value that you might be getting from a nutrient mitigation scheme, for example?
Not at this stage, but if you think of some of the sorts of development and the values that are linked to those, then it's quite obvious to see that there might be significant premiums paid in some instances. But it's still an emerging market and there's no real sort of trend established at this stage.
Now, Natural England's nutrient mitigation scheme and this opportunity to buy land to offset nitrates is still quite unusual. How does it work?
So my experience of this is in the Tees Valley. Natural England have put in place habitat management which avoids the application of nitrogen or potentially removes it. This removal of nitrogen from the ecosystem is what creates the credits. The developer is then able to buy these credits, permitting them to introduce an equivalent amount of nitrogen from their site. So within the catchment as a whole, a neutral position is maintained. And Natural England are having 4 rounds of sales of these credits. They're sold on a first come, first served basis, and the successful applicants from the first round ought to be notified of the outcome of that over the coming weeks. But I'm not aware of any significant private market at this stage, although there are some who've positioned themselves to do this once that opportunity arises.
Now, for some people, it may well be news that house building creates nitrates at all. Do you have a sense of why nitrates are such a problem in terms of house building?
Nitrogen comes from sewage, and therefore the creation of new houses forms new households, and they will in time produce more sewage. But I mean, the problem really sits with the existing housing stock and agriculture. So I think new house building, is only contributing something like 1% to the problem.
So that raises the question as to why this nitrate offsetting is being associated with new building development. Is it simply that we're trying to find a way of sort of paying for or offsetting, trying to reduce the amount of overall nitrates going into sewage systems and into water systems?
There's what's referred to as the Dutch nitrogen case, which was where the Dutch planners effectively erred in considering properly the environmental impact of a scheme that they consented. And that applies to sites of European designations. And so where we've got sites that are of an equivalent value in the UK, then where they are at risk of either nitrogen or phosphate pollution, then local planning authorities have to take that into account. And that's why it's looking at new build developments, but it's obviously a much wider issue that we've got with pollution of the rivers and everything else that's been in the press recently.
Interesting. And in your view, would management for nitrate offsetting on this land exclude food production, or could the offsetting be delivered as part of a stacked enterprise approach to agroecological or regenerative land use?
To my knowledge, that's not been tested widely, but conceptually you ought to be able to take land use which is nitrogen heavy and replace it with one which is less intensive. An example might be taking intensive arable land and putting it into an extensively grazed, species-rich grassland, for instance. I mean, eradicating the application of nitrogen from the new system is clearly the best outcome, I can see authorities struggling with the concept of less nitrogen rather than no nitrogen. But in the no nitrogen scenario, then you might be cutting your species-rich grass for hay or seed and simply not grazing the aftermath.
But potentially there's the opportunity here not to replace agricultural land use with the biodiversity net gain land use, so that a farmer potentially could own that land, could be being paid for food production, but be additionally paid for the nitrogen offsetting as well. How quickly do you expect to see this sort of approach to biodiversity net gain rolling out across the rest of England?
Well, come November, newly consented developments have to provide 10% biodiversity net gain, but the government has been well behind where they should have been on this. Natural England's developing a platform to host a national biodiversity net gain register, and I and others have been helping with the testing of this, but I must admit I've got no idea whether it's going to be available and, crucially, populated with potential receptor sites in time for that deadline in November. If it is, then we should have part of the framework needed for trading on a relatively wide scale. But if it isn't, then local authorities are likely to struggle to put in place an alternative interim measure, which is likely to see further delays in the planning system. But the market will also have to get up to speed with conservation covenants, and it's going to take time for these to bed in and the nuances of how they work to be understood. So it's likely that there will be some unintended consequences of those, and some parties therefore might hold back before entering into the market just to see how those play out. I have seen some estimates that the market annually for BNG habitat is going to be around 10,000 acres or so. So when that hits in full, it's going to be a major new player in what's already a pretty tight market. My guess is that it's probably going to be spring, summer next year before we really see any meaningful impact for that though.
That was Calum Gillhespy from GSC Grays. More about this and our other headline news on our website, 8.9.com. That's all for now. We're back on Friday. Thanks for watching.